The first thing my daughter asked me when we walked into her grandfather's funeral was, "Mommy, why are they pretending we don't belong here?" I looked down at Lily, standing beside me in her black Mary Jane shoes and the navy cardigan she had chosen because she said Grandpa Charles always liked blue, and for 1 second, I had no answer that would not break her heart. The chapel smelled like lilies, polished wood, and expensive perfume, the kind of place where every whisper seemed to know exactly where it belonged. Everyone from the Whitmore family was already seated in the front rows, their backs straight, their faces arranged into perfect grief, their hands folded like they had rehearsed the moment. Above the closed casket, a large framed photo of Charles Whitmore smiled out at the room, silver hair neatly combed, blue eyes warm in a way that made my chest tighten. Lily clutched a small drawing against her stomach, a picture she had made the night before with colored pencils, her, Grandpa Charles, and a bright yellow sun over his old backyard. She had worked on it for nearly an hour, pressing so hard on the paper that the green grass nearly tore through. "I want him to have something happy," she told me. I had promised her we would place it near the flowers. I had promised her she mattered here. But when we stepped toward the front row, Eleanor Whitmore rose from her seat before we reached it. She was Charles's oldest daughter, dressed in a tailored black dress that looked more like a statement than mourning, with pearls at her throat and cold judgment in her eyes. She moved into the aisle and blocked us with a smile so thin it barely counted as one. "Rachel," she said quietly, though not quietly enough, "those seats are for immediate family." I stared at her, certain I had misheard. "Lily is his granddaughter." Eleanor's eyes flicked down to my daughter, then to the drawing in Lily's hands, as if both were inconvenient details someone had failed to remove. "The program has already been arranged," she said. "It would be best if you two sat farther back. We don't want confusion today." Behind her, Margaret Whitmore, Charles's widow, did not turn around. She sat in the center of the first row like a queen accepting sorrow from a distance. David Whitmore, Eleanor's younger brother, glanced over his shoulder, saw us, then looked away as if eye contact might require courage. I felt Lily's fingers slip into mine. They were cold. The guests around us pretended not to watch, but I could feel their curiosity pressing in from every side. Some of them knew me as the woman who had married Andrew Whitmore, Charles's youngest son, the one who died 3 years earlier and left me with a little girl, a stack of medical bills, and a family that suddenly decided love had an expiration date. Others probably knew only what the Whitmores wanted them to know, that I had come from a small house, a public school job, and a life without country clubs, private foundations, or lake houses in Maine. I swallowed the words rising in my throat because Lily was looking up at me, waiting to learn how a person keeps their dignity when someone tries to take it away in public. So I squeezed her hand and said, "Come on, sweetheart. We'll sit where Grandpa can still see us." Eleanor stepped aside only after making sure everyone saw she had won. We walked past the first 3 rows, past cousins who did not smile, past relatives who suddenly became fascinated by their funeral programs, until we found 2 empty seats near the back, behind a man I had never met and a woman who smelled like rose lotion. Lily climbed into the chair beside me without a word. Her little feet did not quite touch the floor. She kept the drawing pressed flat on her lap, smoothing one bent corner with her thumb. On the screen near the front, the memorial slideshow began. Charles holding a fishing rod. Charles at a charity dinner. Charles with Margaret. Charles with Eleanor and David. Charles with grandchildren I barely recognized from holiday cards. Photo after photo filled the screen, each one greeted by soft sighs from the front rows. Then Lily leaned closer and whispered, "Mommy, maybe my picture is coming later." I nodded because I wanted that to be true. But the slideshow ended with the Whitmore family crest fading into gold script, and not one photo of Lily appeared. Not one birthday. Not one backyard visit. Not one image of the little girl who had called him every Sunday evening to tell him about spelling tests, lost teeth, and the stray cat that lived behind our apartment building. Lily lowered her eyes to the drawing in her lap. "Did Grandpa forget me too?" she whispered. That was the moment something inside me went still. Not angry. Not loud. Just still. Because Charles Whitmore had not forgotten Lily. He had called her his little light. He had kept every drawing she mailed him in a wooden box beside his reading chair. And as Eleanor returned to the front row like she had successfully erased us, I looked at Charles's photograph and felt, for the first time that morning, that this funeral was not over. It had only just begun. The service began with the kind of silence that makes every small movement feel too loud. A minister stepped to the front and spoke about legacy, devotion, and the importance of family, and I kept my eyes on Lily because I could not bear to watch the Whitmores pretend those words belonged to them. My daughter sat perfectly still beside me, her drawing resting across her knees like a fragile secret. Every few seconds she looked toward the front row, not at the flowers or the casket, but at Margaret Whitmore. She was waiting for one glance from her grandmother, one tiny sign that someone up there remembered she existed. None came. Margaret dabbed the corner of her eye with a folded tissue, accepting gentle touches on her shoulder from women in black dresses and men in dark suits. Eleanor leaned toward guests and whispered with practiced sorrow. David checked his phone beneath the program, then tucked it away whenever someone looked in his direction. I had seen this performance before, not at a funeral, but at every Whitmore holiday dinner I was allowed to attend only because Andrew insisted. They had always known how to make exclusion look polite. They never had to raise their voices. They simply left your name off a place card, forgot to introduce you, changed the subject when you spoke, or smiled in a way that reminded you the room had been theirs long before you entered it. When I married Andrew, Charles was the only one who stood up during the reception and said, "Rachel brings kindness into this family, and kindness is rarer than money." Margaret had smiled through it as if she were swallowing vinegar. Eleanor had not clapped. David had clapped twice, slowly, then reached for his drink. After Andrew died, the calls stopped first. Then the invitations. Then the birthday cards for Lily came later and later until they stopped too. But Charles never stopped. Every Sunday at 7 o'clock, the phone would ring, and Lily would run across our apartment yelling, "Grandpa Charles is calling." He listened to her talk about school projects, missing front teeth, sidewalk chalk, and the pancakes I'd burned one Saturday morning. Sometimes he asked me if the car was running well or if I needed help with rent, and I always said we were fine, even when fine meant choosing which bill could wait one more week. He never pushed. He just found quiet ways to be there. A grocery card in the mail. A winter coat for Lily with no return address, even though I recognized his careful handwriting. A note tucked inside a children's book that said, "For my little light, because every bright girl needs good stories." At the front of the chapel, Eleanor stepped behind the lectern. Her voice trembled in all the right places as she spoke about her father's discipline, generosity, and commitment to the Whitmore name. She listed the charities he supported, the boards he served on, the properties he restored, the family traditions he protected. Then she said, "Dad believed family was everything." Lily looked up at me again. I felt her question before she asked it. "Then why are we back here?" she whispered. I put my arm around her shoulders and pulled her close. "Because sometimes people forget what family means," I said softly. "But that does not mean Grandpa did." When Eleanor finished, the minister invited family members to place flowers near Charles's casket. Margaret went first. Then Eleanor. Then David. Then cousins, nieces, nephews, and people I had only met once at a Christmas brunch where no one remembered my last name. Lily straightened in her seat and picked up her drawing with both hands. Her face brightened with nervous hope. "Can I give it to him now?" she asked. I nodded and stood with her. We had taken only 3 steps into the aisle when David appeared from the side, blocking our path with an expression that was not angry, just inconvenienced. "Rachel," he said under his breath. "Not now. This part is for the arranged family tribute." I looked past him at the flowers already surrounding Charles, at the polished wooden stand where Lily's drawing should have belonged. "She is his granddaughter," I said. David glanced at the paper in Lily's hands. "There is a table in the back for extra cards." Extra cards. That was what he called a little girl's goodbye to the only grandfather who had loved her without conditions. Lily's fingers tightened around the drawing, bending the sun in the corner. For 1 second, I thought she might cry. Instead, she looked at David with a small, steady sadness that made him look away first. "It is okay, Mommy," she whispered. "Grandpa would know." I walked her back to our seats, but as I sat down, I saw a man in a charcoal suit standing near the chapel doors, watching us with a leather folder pressed against his side. I recognized him from Charles's office years ago. Andrew had once told me his name was Andrew Collins, the family attorney. And unlike everyone else in that room, he was not looking at the Whitmores. He was looking directly at Lily. Andrew Collins did not move right away. He simply stood near the chapel doors with that leather folder against his side, watching the room the way a man watches a clock before a moment he cannot stop finally arrives. I remembered him now more clearly. He had been at Charles's house the summer after Andrew died, sitting in the study with stacks of papers while Margaret complained about probate, taxes, and unnecessary complications. I had been in the hallway with Lily, who was only 5 then, holding a paper bag of blueberry muffins we had brought for Charles because he said hospital food had made him forget what real breakfast tasted like. Margaret had seen us and sighed like we were a scheduling mistake. "Rachel, this really is not a good day," she had said. Before I could apologize and leave, Charles had called from the study. "If that is my granddaughter, she comes in before anyone with a briefcase." Andrew Collins had smiled at that. He had watched Lily run to Charles's chair and climb carefully beside him, offering him a muffin wrapped in a napkin covered with crooked hearts. That was the first time I saw Charles choose us in front of them. It would not be the last. Back in the chapel, the flower tribute continued without us. One cousin placed white roses near the casket. Another laid down a framed family photo from a vacation in Colorado, a photo taken years before Lily was born. Eleanor nodded approvingly each time someone stepped forward, as if she were managing a private event instead of mourning her father. David returned to the front row and leaned close to Margaret, whispering something that made her eyes narrow. I knew they were talking about us. I had learned to recognize the rhythm of Whitmore whispers, the glance first, then the lowered voice, then the polite expression meant to hide the judgment. Lily sat with her drawing folded slightly at the edges. She was trying so hard to be brave that it made her look smaller. I wanted to take her home. I wanted to tell her that grown people who made a child feel unwanted were not worth another minute of her sadness. But Charles had asked us to come. Not through the Whitmores. Never through them. 3 days before the funeral, a cream envelope had appeared in our mailbox with my name written in Charles's unmistakable handwriting. Inside was a note dated 2 months before he passed. "Rachel, if this reaches you, please bring Lily to my service. No matter how uncomfortable they make it. No matter where they seat you. I need my little light in the room." I had read that line 10 times at our kitchen table, while Lily colored beside me. No matter where they seat you. At the time, I thought he was only worried about old tension. Now, sitting in the back of that chapel, I wondered if Charles had known exactly what they would do. The minister returned to the lectern and invited Margaret to speak. She rose slowly, accepting help from David, though she did not need it. Her black dress was perfectly pressed, her silver hair pinned into a flawless twist. She looked like the photograph beside the word widow in some old society magazine. "Charles believed deeply in tradition," she began, her voice soft but clear. "He believed in protecting what generations before him had built." A few people nodded. Eleanor lowered her eyes with dramatic sadness. Margaret continued. "He understood that a family name is not merely inherited. It must be honored by those who know its value." Her gaze swept the chapel and paused, just for a heartbeat, near the back row where Lily and I sat. It was so quick most people would have missed it. I did not. Lily did not either. "Mommy," she whispered. "Is she mad that we came?" I brushed a strand of hair away from her cheek. "No, sweetheart," I lied gently. "She is just having a hard day." Margaret spoke for nearly 10 minutes and never once said Lily's name. She mentioned every grandchild except her. She thanked every branch of the family except the one Andrew had left behind. Then she ended with, "Charles's legacy will remain where it belongs." Eleanor reached for her mother's hand as if the sentence had been beautiful. I felt Lily lean against me, tired from trying to disappear. Then, just as the minister stepped forward to close the service, Andrew Collins finally walked down the aisle. His shoes made quiet, steady sounds against the polished floor. He stopped beside the lectern, leaned toward the minister, and said something too soft for the room to hear. The minister looked surprised. Margaret turned sharply in her seat. Eleanor's face tightened. David sat up straight. Andrew Collins opened the leather folder and removed a sealed envelope. Then he looked toward the back of the chapel, not at me, but at Lily. "Before we conclude," he said, "Charles Whitmore left one final instruction. He requested that this letter be read aloud today, in this room, with everyone present." The room changed before a single word of the letter was read. It was not loud. No one gasped. No one stood. But every polished face in the front rows tightened at once, as if Andrew Collins had opened a window and let in air they had been trying to keep out. Margaret turned in her seat with a look so sharp it made the minister step back from the lectern. "Mr. Collins," she said, her voice still soft enough for a funeral but hard enough for everyone nearby to hear, "this is neither the time nor the place." Andrew Collins did not lower the envelope. "Mrs. Whitmore, Charles was very clear. The letter is to be read before the service concludes, before the family leaves the chapel, and in the presence of all invited guests." Eleanor rose halfway from her chair. "We can handle private family matters later." Mr. Collins looked at her for one calm second. "That is precisely what your father did not want." A thin silence spread across the room. I felt Lily press closer to my side. She did not understand legal instructions or family politics, but she understood tone. She understood that the adults in the front row were suddenly afraid of a piece of paper. David leaned toward Margaret and whispered something quickly, but she did not answer him. Her eyes were fixed on the envelope as if it had personally betrayed her. Mr. Collins broke the seal with careful fingers and unfolded several pages written in Charles's familiar handwriting. I recognized the slight slant of his letters, the same handwriting from birthday cards, thank you notes, and the envelope that had asked us to come no matter where they seated us. My throat tightened before he even began. Mr. Collins adjusted his glasses and read, "To Rachel and my sweet Lily, the only two people in my last years who came to me without asking for anything." The words landed so heavily that even the air seemed to stop moving. Lily's head snapped toward me. Her eyes were wide. "Mommy," she whispered. "He said my name?" I nodded, but I could not speak. Across the chapel, several guests turned to look at us. Not with pity this time. With surprise. With curiosity. With the uncomfortable realization that the two people seated near the back were not there by accident. Mr. Collins continued, "If this letter is being read aloud, then my family has done exactly what I feared they would do. They have placed Rachel and Lily where they believe they belong, out of view. Out of honor, and far from the name they think belongs only to them." Eleanor's face went pale beneath her makeup. David looked down at the floor. Margaret sat perfectly still, but one hand gripped the funeral program so tightly the paper bent in half. "I want everyone in this room to know," the letter continued, "that Rachel Miller did not chase this family, did not chase our money, and did not ask me for favors after my son Andrew passed away. She worked. She raised Lily. She carried grief with more grace than many people in this room have carried comfort. And every time I offered help, she answered with dignity before she answered with need." A woman 2 rows ahead of us turned fully around now, her eyes softening when she saw Lily holding the folded drawing. I remembered all the times I had said no to Charles because I was afraid accepting anything would prove the Whitmores right about me. I remembered him smiling gently and saying, "Rachel, pride is useful, but so is letting someone love you." Mr. Collins read on, and his voice grew quieter, not weaker, but more personal. "Lily, if you are sitting in that chapel today, I hope you are holding one of your pictures. I hope it has too much yellow in the sun and grass that goes all the way to the edge of the page. I hope your mother lets you place it near me, but if they stop you, do not be ashamed. Some people only recognize value when a lawyer reads it to them. A small, stunned sound moved through the chapel. Lily looked down at her drawing, then slowly unfolded the bent corner where the yellow sun shone above the green grass. Her bottom lip trembled, but she did not cry. She held the picture a little higher, as if Charles might truly see it from wherever love goes when the body is gone. Mr. Collins paused for only a breath before reading the next line. Now, to my wife Margaret, my daughter Eleanor, and my son David, I need you to listen carefully, because I knew what you were doing long before you thought I did. Mr. Collins held the page steady, but the room no longer felt steady at all. Every person who had spent the morning pretending not to see us was now looking between the front row and the back row, trying to understand how a funeral they thought they controlled had turned into a confession Charles had arranged from beyond their reach. Margaret, Mr. Collins read, you told me more than once that Rachel was not the kind of woman Andrew should have married. You said she was too ordinary, too quiet, too far from the life we built. But you never understood that Andrew chose her for the very reason you dismissed her. She loved him without calculation. She stood beside him when there was no advantage in doing so. And when he was gone, she did not use Lily as a key to our door. She built a life for that child with tired hands, honest work, and a strength this family rarely bothered to notice. Margaret's chin lifted, but her face had lost its color. Eleanor stared at the floor as if she could make the words pass over her by refusing to meet them. David rubbed one hand over his mouth, and for the first time all morning, he looked less bored than trapped. Mr. Collins turned the page. Eleanor, I heard what you said in my hallway last Thanksgiving when you thought I was asleep. You said Rachel would eventually come asking for money. You said Lily would grow up expecting things that were not hers. I want you to know that the next morning, Lily came into my room with a paper turkey she made at school, and on each feather she had written something she was thankful for. One feather said Mommy. One feather said pancakes. One feather said Grandpa calls me every Sunday. Not one feather said money. A quiet murmur moved through the chapel. Lily looked at me, confused and amazed. He kept that? She whispered. Yes, I said, because I knew Charles kept everything. He kept her cards, her drawings, the school photo where her bangs were uneven because she had tried to trim them herself. He kept proof of love the way other men kept stock certificates and property deeds. Mr. Collins continued, David, you visited me 4 times in my final year. Twice you asked about signatures. Once you asked if I had reconsidered the lake house. The last time you asked whether it was practical for me to continue covering certain charitable commitments after my health had declined. Rachel visited with soup she made in a dented pot. Lily visited with library books and read to me even when she stumbled over the big words. One of you saw an old man with assets. 2 of them saw a lonely grandfather who still liked tomato soup and stories about 2nd grade. David's shoulders sank. A man near the aisle shook his head slowly, not in anger exactly, but in disappointment. That seemed worse. I could feel the room learning the truth piece by piece, and each piece moved Lily and me closer to the center without either of us leaving our seats. Mr. Collins read, You may wonder why I did not say all of this while I was alive. The answer is simple. I tried. Pride does not listen when it is comfortable. So I asked my attorney to make sure my words would be heard in the one place where none of you could leave early without showing everyone who you are. Eleanor looked up sharply. This is cruel, she said, her voice shaking. Mr. Collins lowered the page for the first time. These are your father's words. The minister stood silently beside him, hands folded, making no attempt to interrupt. Even he seemed to understand that the service had shifted into something Charles had planned with painful precision. Mr. Collins lifted the letter again. Rachel, if you are embarrassed by this attention, I am sorry. I know you never wanted a scene. You never wanted repayment. You never wanted the Whitmore name to make you feel taller. But I also know you spent years making yourself smaller so they would not accuse you of reaching for what was never their kindness to guard. That ends today. My eyes burned, but I refused to let the tears fall yet. Lily slid her hand into mine, and this time her fingers were warm. And Lily. Mr. Collins read, his voice softening. If they seated you in the back, stand up when this letter is done. Not because you need to prove anything to them, but because I want every person in that room to see my granddaughter exactly as I saw her. Bright, gentle, brave, and never once less than family. For a moment, nobody moved. Mr. Collins lowered the page slightly, giving the words room to settle, and the entire chapel seemed to turn toward the back row where Lily sat with her drawing in both hands. I felt her look up at me before I looked down at her. There was fear in her eyes, but there was something else too, something small and glowing beneath the hurt. She had spent the whole morning trying to become invisible because the adults in the front row had taught her that being noticed would only bring more embarrassment. Now her grandfather, in the last public words he had chosen for this world, had asked her to stand. "Do I have to?" she whispered. I brushed my thumb over her knuckles. "Only if you want to, sweetheart." She looked toward Charles's photograph, then down at the yellow sun in her drawing. Slowly, she slid off the chair. Her feet touched the floor, and because she was only 8 years old, standing in the aisle of that grand chapel made her look impossibly small. But the silence around her made her seem larger than anyone sitting in the front row. I stood beside her, not to speak for her, only to make sure she knew she would never have to stand alone. Mr. Collins gave her a gentle nod, then continued reading. "Lily, I am sorry if today made you wonder whether you belong to this family. You belonged to me from the first time your father placed you in my arms, and you opened your eyes like you were already asking questions. You belonged to me when you sent me drawings with crooked houses and enormous flowers. You belonged to me when you called every Sunday and told me stories that made my quiet house feel alive again. No chair assignment, no printed program, and no cold heart can remove you from where love has placed you." Someone in the chapel sniffled. Not from the front row. From somewhere behind us, where the people who had watched quietly were now hearing what kindness sounded like when written by a dying man with nothing left to protect except the truth. Lily pressed the drawing against her chest. Margaret stared forward, rigid as stone. Eleanor's lips parted like she wanted to object, but no words came. David looked at Lily once, then looked away as if her small face carried more honesty than he could bear. Mr. Collins turned to the next page. "Now, because love without protection is only a wish, I have made decisions that may surprise those who believed my silence was agreement. Rachel is to be recognized as Lily's legal guardian in every matter connected to what I leave behind. She is the only person I trust to protect my granddaughter's heart before protecting any account, property, or family reputation." My breath caught. I had expected comfort from Charles. I had not expected protection. The letter continued. "The house on Briarwood Lane, where Lily learned to ride her scooter in the driveway and where Andrew once carved his initials under the porch rail, is to be placed in trust for Lily. Rachel may live there with her, maintain it, or lease it for Lily's benefit until Lily turns 25. The education fund I established years ago will be expanded from my estate, enough to cover private school if Rachel chooses, college, graduate school, and any honest dream Lily is brave enough to follow." Eleanor stood so fast her purse slipped from her lap. "This cannot be right," she said, her voice sharp now, no longer pretending grief was her only emotion. Mr. Collins did not raise his voice. "Miss Whitmore, your father anticipated that response." He looked back at the letter. "To anyone who objects before this letter is finished, I ask you to consider whether you are grieving me or grieving what you thought you would receive." Eleanor froze. The words struck harder than any argument could have. A murmur rippled through the chapel, and for the first time all morning, it was not aimed at me. Mr. Collins read on. "Margaret will retain what is already hers by law and by our marriage agreements. Eleanor and David will each receive the specific gifts listed in the secondary document. But the heart of what I built, the home where love still has a chance to grow, belongs to the child you tried to seat behind strangers." Lily looked up at me, confused by the size of what had just been said, but clear on the one part that mattered. Grandpa gave me his house? She whispered. I knelt beside her in the aisle, my eyes finally filling. He gave you a place where no one can tell you that you do not belong. The words seemed too large for Lily to hold all at once. She kept staring at me, then at Mr. Collins, then toward the photograph of Charles, as if she expected someone to explain that a mistake had been made. But no one corrected him. No one laughed. No one stood to say the letter was false. Even Eleanor, who had always treated confidence like a family heirloom, stood frozen beside the front row with her mouth slightly open and her hands clenched around nothing. Margaret finally turned around and looked at Lily for the first time that day. Not with warmth. Not with apology. With calculation. I saw it so clearly that my whole body went cold. Only minutes ago, Lily had been invisible to her. Now that Charles had attached a house, an education fund, and public honor to that same little girl, Margaret looked at her as if she had suddenly become something to manage. Mr. Collins must have seen it too, because he did not give anyone time to recover. He lifted the page again and continued. Because I know my family, I have added protections. If any relative attempts to pressure Rachel, frighten Lily, challenge Rachel's role through intimidation, or remove Lily from her mother's care for financial advantage, that person will forfeit every gift I have left to them in the secondary document. Eleanor's face tightened. That is ridiculous, she said, but her voice had lost its polish. Mr. Collins looked at her calmly. It is legally binding. The room stirred. A few guests exchanged looks. David leaned toward Eleanor and whispered, Sit down. She did not sit at first. She looked around, perhaps expecting someone to defend her, but the people who had smiled at her all morning now looked away. Finally, she lowered herself into the chair, stiff and furious. Mr. Collins continued reading. I do not write this out of anger. I write it because I waited too long to correct what I allowed. When Andrew married Rachel, I watched my family measure her by the wrong things. I thought time would soften you. I thought Lily's birth would open your hearts. I was wrong. And my greatest regret is that I did not say so loudly enough while Andrew was alive. Hearing Andrew's name made my chest ache in a different way. I thought of him standing in our tiny first apartment, laughing because the kitchen drawer stuck every time he opened it. I thought of the night he held newborn Lily against his shoulder and whispered, My dad is going to spoil her rotten. He had believed love would be enough to make the Whitmores accept us. Charles had hoped the same. Both of them had been kinder than the world they came from. Mr. Collins read, Rachel, I know you will be tempted to refuse what I have left because you fear it will look like you finally took something from us. Do not refuse. This is not charity. This is not payment. This is a grandfather keeping a promise to his son and to his granddaughter. You owe no apology for accepting protection that should have been offered from the beginning. I covered my mouth with one hand, not to hide tears, but to hold myself together. Lily leaned into me, and I felt the corner of her drawing brush my arm. The yellow sun was still bent, but it had not torn. Then Mr. Collins looked toward the minister and said, Charles left one more instruction for this portion of the service. He read from the final lines on the page. The drawing Lily brings today is not to be placed on a table in the back. It is to be placed beside my photograph, in front of the flowers, where everyone can see it. If she is willing, I would like her to do it herself. The chapel went completely still. Lily looked up at the long aisle between us and the front of the room. It was only about 30 feet, but to an 8-year-old who had been rejected in public, it must have looked like a mile. Mommy, she whispered, will they be mad? I looked at Margaret, Eleanor, and David. Then I looked back at my daughter. Maybe, I said softly. But that does not mean they are right. Lily breathed in, small and shaky. Then she held out her hand. I took it, and together we stepped into the aisle. This time, no one blocked us. This time, every head turned as we walked forward. The same aisle that had felt humiliating when we were sent to the back now felt like the path Charles had saved for us all along. When we reached the front, Lily paused beside the flowers. She looked at the drawing once, smoothed the corner with her palm, and placed it carefully beside Charles's photograph. The bright yellow sun faced the room. Under it, in careful second-grade handwriting, Lily had written, "Grandpa, you made me feel like family." For several seconds, the only color in the chapel seemed to be the yellow sun in Lily's drawing. Everything else was black dresses, dark suits, white flowers, and pale faces, but that small piece of paper looked alive beside Charles's photograph. I stood behind Lily with my hands resting lightly on her shoulders, and I could feel the tiny tremble running through her body. She had done what Charles asked. She had walked past every person who made her feel unwanted and placed her love where it belonged. No one could move it to a back table now. No one could pretend it was extra. Mr. Collins waited until Lily turned around before he continued. "Charles also requested," he said, reading from the letter again, "that Lily's drawing remain with me until the burial, and afterward, that it be framed and hung in the front hallway of the Briarwood house. Not in a child's room. Not in storage. In the front hallway, where every person who enters will understand what mattered to me at the end." Lily looked up at me as if she did not quite understand why adults were suddenly listening to her grandfather talk about her picture like it was something precious. I bent closer and whispered, "He wanted everyone to see it." Her eyes moved toward Margaret. For one brief second, I hoped Margaret might soften. I hoped grief, embarrassment, or even the simple sight of an 8-year-old girl standing near her grandfather's casket would reach whatever part of her had once held her own children when they were small. But Margaret did not soften. Her face became composed in a different way, the way it did when she was preparing to save herself. She rose slowly from the front row. "This is a deeply emotional day," she said, turning just enough for the guests to hear her. "Charles was ill for a long time. I think we should all be careful about interpreting private words in a public moment." Mr. Collins folded one page down and looked at her. "Mrs. Whitmore, your husband anticipated that too." Margaret's lips tightened. "Of course he did," Eleanor said under her breath, but the words carried farther than she intended. Mr. Collins read, "If anyone suggests that my illness weakened my judgment, let them know that this letter, my trust documents, and my estate instructions were prepared while I was evaluated and confirmed competent by 2 physicians and witnessed according to law. I was tired, not confused. I was dying, not blind." The room went quiet again, but this silence was different. It did not belong to shock anymore. It belonged to consequence. Margaret sat down as slowly as she had stood. David leaned back and closed his eyes for one moment, as if finally understanding that there was no hallway conversation, no private pressure, no family connection that could erase what Charles had arranged. Eleanor's fingers moved restlessly over the pearls at her neck. The guests had stopped pretending this was only a family matter. They had become witnesses, exactly as Charles intended. Mr. Collins continued, "I ask those present today not to mistake wealth for worth, volume for truth, or a family name for family love. The people who carried my name were not always the people who carried my loneliness. The child you seated in the back carried more light into my final year than all the formal visits, managed schedules, and inheritance discussions combined." I felt Lily lean back against me. The words were too grown for her, but the meaning was not. She knew Charles had loved her. She knew he had seen her. That was enough for today. The minister stepped forward, his voice gentle but firm. It seems Mr. Whitmore had a final blessing to give. No one argued. Mr. Collins reached the last paragraph of the letter. "Rachel, take Lily home after this and do not let anyone make you feel guilty for being protected. If they come to you with soft voices and hard intentions, remember that I knew them before you did. You are not responsible for preserving the comfort of people who were comfortable excluding a child. You are responsible for Lily. That is where your loyalty belongs." My hand tightened around Lily's shoulder. For years I had tried to be reasonable. I had tried not to seem bitter. I had swallowed small insults because I thought peace was better for my daughter than conflict. But Charles had named the truth plainly, and once truth is spoken in a room full of witnesses, it becomes harder for everyone to pretend it is rude. Mr. Collins lowered the letter. That concludes Mr. Whitmore's instruction for the service. The chapel remained still. Then an older woman I did not know stood from the left side of the room, walked to Lily, and gently said, "Your grandfather would have loved that drawing." Lily looked at me for permission, then nodded. One by one, people began approaching us, not the front row. Some offered quiet condolences. Some looked ashamed. Some simply touched Lily's shoulder and moved on. And through it all, Margaret, Eleanor, and David remained seated beneath the weight of a room that no longer belonged to them. The line of guests moved around us slowly, but for the first time that morning, no one treated Lily like she was in the way. People bent down to speak to her gently. Some told her Charles had once talked about a granddaughter who made him laugh. Others admitted they had not known who she was, and their embarrassment showed more honesty than any apology the Whitmores had offered. Lily stayed close to me, one hand holding mine, the other resting against the side of her dress as if she still expected someone to send us back to our seats. But no one did. Her drawing remained beside Charles's photograph, bright and impossible to ignore. When the minister gave the final prayer, I bowed my head and felt a strange peace settle over me. Not happiness. Nothing about that day could be called happy. But there was relief in knowing Charles had not left Lily defenseless in a room full of people who mistook cruelty for tradition. When the service ended, the guests began filing toward the reception hall, speaking in low voices that no longer sounded impressed by the Whitmore name. Margaret stayed near the front, receiving condolences with a stiff smile that appeared and vanished like something forced into place. Eleanor avoided looking at us altogether. David walked toward Andrew Collins, but stopped when the attorney lifted one hand and quietly said, "All estate conversations will happen at my office, with proper notice, and with Rachel present." David's face tightened, but he stepped back. I took Lily's coat from the chair and helped her into it. The sleeves were a little short because she had grown nearly an inch since winter, and I made a quiet promise to myself that I would buy her a new one before the cold settled in again. It was such an ordinary thought, so small and motherly, that it nearly broke me after everything we had just heard. Lily looked toward the front one last time. "Can I say goodbye to Grandpa?" she asked. "Of course," I said. We walked together to Charles's photograph. Lily stood on her toes, touched two fingers to the edge of the frame, and whispered, "Thank you for remembering me." I closed my eyes because those 6 words carried every wound of that morning and every repair Charles had tried to make. As we turned to leave, Margaret stepped into our path. Up close, she looked older than she had from the back row, but not softer. Her eyes went to Lily first, then to me. "Rachel," she said, carefully measured, "this has been an emotional misunderstanding. We should discuss what is best for Lily as a family." There it was. Not an apology. Not grief. A strategy dressed as concern. Before I could answer, Lily moved half a step behind me. That tiny movement gave me all the courage I needed. "What is best for Lily," I said calmly, "is that she never has to earn a place in a family that should have loved her freely." Margaret's mouth tightened. "You are making this difficult." "No," I said. "Charles made it clear." Eleanor appeared beside her mother, her eyes bright with anger she was trying to hide. "You cannot expect to just walk away with the house." Andrew Collins was suddenly beside us, his leather folder tucked beneath one arm. "She can walk away today with her daughter, her dignity, and my assurance that every instruction Charles left will be followed exactly." Eleanor looked as if she wanted to argue, but half the room was still watching. That was the power of what Charles had done. He had not only given us protection. He had given us witnesses. I thanked Andrew Collins quietly and guided Lily down the aisle. This time, no one blocked us. This time, the front row had to watch us leave first. Outside, the late afternoon air was cold enough to turn Lily's cheeks pink. She slipped her hand into mine and leaned against my coat. "Mommy," she said, "are we really going to live in Grandpa's house?" I looked across the parking lot at the bare trees moving gently in the wind. "Maybe," I said. "But only if it feels like home to you." She thought about that, then nodded. It will, she said. Because he wanted us there. I opened the car door for her, and before she climbed in, Andrew Collins called my name. He crossed the sidewalk and handed me a smaller envelope, cream-colored, sealed, with Charles's handwriting across the front. My fingers went still when I read the words. Rachel, open this only when they try to make you doubt yourself. I looked up at Andrew Collins. His expression was kind, but serious. He said you would know when the time was right. I held the envelope against my chest as Lily buckled herself into the back seat. Through the chapel windows, I could still see the glow of her yellow sun beside Charles's photograph. For years, the Whitmores had made me feel like I had entered their family through a side door. But that day, Charles opened the front door for Lily, placed her name where no one could erase it, and reminded every person in that room that love does not become less real just because proud people refuse to recognize it.